The next slide gives you projections of climate change in the future and in terms of increases in temperature. You find that, for instance, between now and the end of the century, we are likely to see a average temperature increase of 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius. And in order to focus on what this might be, both at the lower and the upper end, we have come up with what we call best estimates of 1.8 degrees Celsius at the lower end and 4 degrees Celsius at the upper end. Water availability will be affected for consumption, agriculture, and energy generation because there are changes taking place in precipitation patterns, glaciers melting, and therefore this would lead to decrease in river flows, increasing salinity of groundwater. So these are factors that would certainly change the water regime in the years ahead. And we've estimated people who would be exposed to increased water stress by 2020. If you look at the case of Asia, anywhere from 120 to 1.2 billion people would be subjected to water stress as early as 2020. In the case of Africa, this would be anywhere from 75 to 250 million. We turn to the next slide. There would be impacts of climate change on food insecurity. Water stress, of course, is one reason, but also the direct impacts of climate change on agriculture will lead to something like 50% of a yield reduction in some African countries. And of course, in Central and South Asia, by 2050, we could have a reduction of about 30%. That clearly has very serious implications for food security in this region. Next slide, please. There would be impacts of climate change on peace and security because there would be greater conflict for scarce resources with the impacts of climate change, and this can lead to tensions among different users and possibly even conflict. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the important thing to remember is that there is substantial potential for the mitigation of global greenhouse gas emissions over the coming decades, and that we could reduce emissions below current levels if we are really determined. Next slide. It's important to remember that if we look at this particular table, that if we want to stabilize global mean temperature increase to about 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, then we have very little time because CO2 emissions would need to peak no later than 2015. And if we go to the next slide, we would see that the cost of mitigation in this manner would really not be very high. It would be less than 3% of the GDP in 2030. That's clearly not a high price to pay for avoiding some of the most serious impacts of climate change. Next slide. There is enormous mitigation potential in a number of sectors, and we also know that most of the mitigation that can be started today can be based on technologies that are either available already or are likely to be commercialized very soon. But of course, if we want to bring about bigger reductions in the future, then we need a mix of policies which provide incentives and disincentives to bring about changes in the right direction. Next slide. This gives you a relative picture of the impacts of mitigation on GDP growth. If you look at the first line, then you find that without mitigation, GDP increases at a certain level. With mitigation, that line bends a little downwards. And then you would find that, really speaking, what this implies is that the level of prosperity that we would have reached in 2030 would perhaps be postponed by a few months or at the most by a year, which is really not a very high price to pay for avoiding some of the most serious impacts of climate change. Next slide. There are huge co-benefits with mitigation, and these include health co-benefits, because if you mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, you would also be reducing the emissions of other pollutants, and that carries very large health benefits. There would be benefits in the nature of greater employment, because, for instance, Renewable energy systems require much greater employment than centralized fossil fuel based energy supply systems. There would also be increased energy security because we would use energy more efficiently and greater use of renewable sources of energy, all of which would reduce the pressure on fossil fuels and bring about greater energy security. We also know that mitigation actions can result in a large number of near-term co-benefits, and these may really cut down mitigation costs substantially. In fact, in several cases, you might actually be able to carry out mitigation at negative costs, or let us say at net benefits to society. Let me turn to the next slide, and this clearly identifies the need for us to find a new development path, a new paradigm, because we have now become accustomed to a system of consumption and production which clearly is unsustainable. And therefore, we have to bring about some major structural changes in the economy of each country, certainly on the geographical distribution of activities, including urbanization, suburbanization. We need to look at consumption patterns and lifestyle changes, and of course there would also be need for bringing about some demographic changes. And I turn now to the next slide, the final slide. Mahatma Gandhi was right when he said that democracy must, in essence, therefore mean the art and science of mobilizing the entire physical, economic, and spiritual resources of all the various sections of the people in the service of the common good of all. And I think this is what we need to do, and therefore mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases and stabilizing the Earth's climate is clearly a win-win solution. It would bring about, as I said earlier, several co-benefits that would make the cost of bringing about this action really insignificant, if not actually negative. Thank you very much.